All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome. This is the panel on climate assessment and adaptation pathways in New York City with a focus on New York City. Thank you for joining this afternoon. My name is Allison Bridges. I finished a postdoc with the Earth Institute last year, and now I'm a lecturer in the Sustainability Management Program in the School of Professional Studies. And I had the privilege of working with the city on an initiative called the Climate Knowledge Exchange this past year, which is a climate assessment initiative together with community engagement. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm just going to give everyone on the panel a chance to introduce themselves first, and we'll start with Anna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Anna Lopresti. I'm the Sustained Assessment Specialist with the Consortium on Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, and I'm based at Columbia University. I work with local and state government agencies and community-based organizations on climate adaptation planning, specifically in the urban corridor in the Northeast, including Philly, New York, and Boston.
All right, great. Nicole?
Hello, everyone. It's an honor to be here. My name is Nicole Cabral, and I'm the Associate Director for New York Engagement Programs at Public Agenda. I'm responsible for the development and implementation of all of our programs around engagement with an eye on integrating an equity lens in our work. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Adam?
Hi, everyone. Sorry for the formal use of my mask, but I'm Adam Paris. I'm the Deputy Director for Climate Science and Risk Communication at the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency. I work to help connect science to decision-making in an equitable way for the city, including efforts like we'll talk about, the Climate Knowledge Exchange, but also working with the New York City Panel on Climate Change.
Great, thanks, Adam. And Danny?
Good afternoon. How you doing, everybody? My name is Danny Peralta. I'm the Executive Managing Director at the Point Community Development Corporation. We've been working now since 1994 on the widespread revitalization of cultural and economic of the community. Most recently, we've been working with multiple partners, including NIJA and folks like yourself, on some resiliency planning, emergency preparedness, work through the South Bronx Community Resiliency Agenda. Good to be here today. Thank you for having me.
All right, great. Thanks, Danny. I just want to give a quick reminder to everyone. Any questions you have, just please put them in the chat so that they'll be there when we get to the question and answer period. We are going to, the format today is we're going to go through some presentations from each of us, and then we'll have some moderated discussion, and then we'll move on to your questions and answers. So just feel free anytime to pop in your questions to the chat, and we'll get to them later in the panel. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Adam to get us started.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. And I'm going to keep my remarks, probably share just briefer remarks than my counterparts, my fellow panelists, and hopefully kind of set up some themes for discussion later on. So I will talk about a specific initiative, but I also want to kind of pinpoint parts of that initiative that Allison will describe in more detail that also relate to some of the things that Anna, Nicole, and Danny have been working on in their work and in the work we've done together. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the Climate Knowledge Exchange. It's a process we've set up to continually refine and develop a climate research agenda for the city, as well as continue to promote shared learning and two-way information exchange on climate risks. It's an initiative that was sort of born out of the Mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency, but done in partnership with an organization called Sci4NY and the New York City Panel on Climate Change. And the impetus behind that is that we know climate change is here now. We're experiencing impacts like nuisance flooding or sunny day flooding, where in certain low-lying neighborhoods across the city, we experience flooding 20 to 30 times a year, even when it's not stormy. That can disrupt work and school commutes, increase exposure to mold in homes, and generally disrupt people's quality of life. It's certainly not the only climate impact, but it's one that relevant to this conference. We know that we're experiencing now. It's not a far off thing. We also know not everyone is experiencing these climate impacts equally. Looking at a different climate hazard, extreme heat. This is the Heat Vulnerability Index developed by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene that couples data on extreme heat with data on socioeconomic, different socioeconomic factors and health factors to show not only where it's hottest, but where people are impacted most by extreme heat. So not everyone is impacted equally. So as we respond to climate risks, we think about an inclusive and fair public process. That's a really important part of equity and making adaptation equitable in New York City. And that's not just with respect to how we act in response to climate, but also relatedly, who gets to decide what research happens. So that's what the climate knowledge exchange, the sort of driving question behind the climate knowledge exchange is, who gets to decide what climate research happens. And we're really increasingly trying to take a participatory or a very inclusive approach to answering that question and formulating this agenda. So last year was the first time that we endeavored to do this. We engaged a number of different people from July to March. Again, Allison's going to talk more about this, but a lot of different organizations from both government and community-based organizations and other regional nonprofits that think about a lot of different issues, that work on everything from the environment to housing to urban planning, and a lot of different that occupy a lot of different institutional spaces. Like I said, those focused on specific neighborhoods and communities, those focused on the city, and students ranging from high school students all the way up through graduate students. And we took a lot of their input and our first report is, and the first version of this Living Climate Research Agenda is the State of the Climate Knowledge 2021. We, just to preview a little bit of what came out of that Allison will expand on, is we saw a lot of agreement between government agency staff and folks who work outside of government in terms of the way that they want to be involved in both developing and understanding information on climate risks, a lot of agreement on where we need to know more, and a lot of agreement just in terms of how they want that engagement process to happen. So for this year, what we're going to be doing, and again, I'm going to focus less on the focus areas or the actual agenda, research agenda, and a little more on the process. So next year, what we'd really love to do is continue this process of information exchange and shared learning, and really open it up to where it's not a mayor's Office of Climate Resiliency initiative or solely an initiative. It's one that's co-owned and shared by all the people who are involved, because not only because we want this to reflect everybody's knowledge base, and we want this to be inclusive, but also because the same network of people who want to learn more, want to weigh in on what we know and what we don't know, have information to share, are also the same network of people that are really needed to collectively respond to climate change. So a lot of this is about building networks and improving, not only improving information flow, but improving the relationships and social ties that we need to help New Yorkers be, help each other be more prepared, help each other adapt to what's coming. So this process that we've been following this set of workshops that was very participatory, listening sessions, workshops, etc., followed a set of principles, right? So we wanted this to be participatory. We took all of the input and we analyzed it because we want to be data driven. In other words, by that we mean not that data rules all, but that we're very much homing in on what we heard and not just what we wanted to hear. And accountable. So we report back. In these reports, we know that much more than a report is needed to respond to climate change, but we also feel like by documenting what we heard on an annual basis, we're building lines of accountability because it's there and people can see where do we still have gaps and where have we actually closed some of those gaps and where are we learning more. And over time, we keep doing this on an annual basis, not because we want the agenda to shift all over the place, but because over time we can include more people and accrue more of those benefits that others are going to talk about when we sustain engagement. So where we are right now is just to be very humble about it. We were very much informing and linking expertise and this first pass, what we really like to get to this year is a focused collaboration, more of that co-ownership. And then where we aim to be is really promoting social learning, which would be a dramatic culture change in the sciences and is something that we see as really essential to coastal adaptation. And that really ties back to, I think, what you're going to hear a lot about in terms of what Allison will present on the Climate Knowledge Exchange, but also what Anna, Nicole, and Danny are going to present in their work and their perspectives is really climbing the ladder of citizen participation, or as folks at the Movement Strategy Center laid out in this graphic, which I really like, is sort of moving from that kind of the different, moving across the different spectrum of community engagement, where it's not just about voice, but also about co-owning and actually sharing in the process of responding to what we hear. So you're going to hear a lot of great work here. You're going to see a lot of great work and hear a lot of great insights. And I'll stop there and pass it along to our panel, which I will introduce. So next up, we're going to hear about Nicole, hear from Nicole. And I will stop my video and Nicole, please take it away.
Thank you, Adam. I hope everyone can see my slides.
Yep.
Okay. So I have a lot to share with you all in 10 minutes. So I'm going to try and speak as quickly as I can. I apologize for that upfront. So again, my name is Nicole Cabral. I work with Public Agenda, and just a quick overview of Public Agenda. We are a nonpartisan nonprofit based in Brooklyn, New York. We do public opinion research, which for me is a fancy way of saying deep listening. And we do public engagement, which I term as problem solving around the issues that we heard through the research. For us, engagement is about the relationships between people and the institutions that serve them, but it's also about the relationships amongst people. And that's really important. Essentially, that's social network, social capital, social cohesion. It's just a fancy way of saying community. And a lot of the research across the world is showing that communities with strong social capital are more resilient in the face of disasters. And we see that in the Indian Ocean tsunami. We see that in the Gulf Coast, US Gulf Coast, after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita, Gustav and Ike. For us, engagement is also about meeting people where they are and treating them as adults with respect. A lot of our work at Public Agenda is really around sustaining engagement, which Adam referenced. So it's not a one-off engagement in a response to a crisis or a shock or a disaster. It's really about building a system or a culture for engagement so that all types of people are able and empowered to participate and have a voice and have power at all times, not just when it's sort of crunch time. So I'm going to talk a little bit about work that I did prior to coming to Public Agenda, and then I'm going to fast forward to some of the work that we're doing right now. So several years ago, right after Hurricane Katrina, I moved down to the Gulf Coast and started to work on a number of initiatives. And one of them that was probably the most powerful one is a network that we worked with a community, several communities, actually about 12 communities from Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama to build. And this network included folks from the nonprofit community, from very grassroots nonprofits, from tribal communities, as well as several local governments. And it really spanned the spectrum in terms of the type of communities. So we worked with very urban neighborhoods like the Lower Ninth Ward. And we also worked with cities like Moss Point, Mississippi. And we worked with some very small fishing villages like Grand Bayou in Plaquemines Parish, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute. And something that was really important for our work is, well, let me actually take a step back. What did this network do? So we convened a group of leaders, about 30 to 40 leaders over the course of a little over a year, where we worked with them to determine what sort of priorities that they wanted to address. We helped them organize convenings so that they can network together and address and kind of talk through those issues. We provided them with some technical support as well in between the meetings, and also supported them on site visits so that they can showcase the work that they're doing in the community with other groups amongst the Gulf Coast. Now, with this project, we really started with some deep listening to hear what is important to the communities that we're working with. And I just wanted to highlight a few. Number one is honoring their knowledge. We were very intentional about not defining what sustainability is. I think that's really important, leaving that up to the people who are on the front lines. So for example, in the Lower Ninth Ward, sustainability is creating the first carbon neutral neighborhood in the United States. For a community like Turkey Creek out of Gulfport, Mississippi, sustainability is not planning them out of existence. Have the airport right there, you have Highway 90, Highway 10, and they're literally being planned out of existence. In other communities, sustainability is a little bit more around the lines of maybe environmental sustainability. So that's okay having different definitions. We can still work together even if we have different priorities or different ways of defining what our problem is. The other thing that I think is really important to highlight is language matters. After Hurricane Katrina, a lot of money, resources, and people flooded the Gulf Coast as experts. And folks on the coast said, we're experts. Why, it's really interesting that other people are defining themselves as leaders and experts. We're experts in our own right, and we should be respected in that vein. And that was really important to uplift and uphold. The other thing that we heard is that there weren't many opportunities to connect with each other. So the network, a very loose network that honors them, their experience, their culture, that incorporates storytelling, jokes, music, time to connect and breathe on their pace was really, really important to them. Just a quick note about this network. I told you it's about a year-long network, and money dried up, and the organization I was with decided not to pursue it any further, which is really upsetting. But coincidentally, it sort of ended right in the midst of the oil disaster, not an oil spill, it was an oil disaster. It was literally in people's backyards in Coden, Alabama, watching the oil wash into their property. And I was doing the final assessment, and they were saying that the importance of the network was incredible because of the networking capabilities that they had during that time. They were stronger and more resilient to deal with an unnatural disaster on such a large scale as the oil disaster. So again, uplifting and highlighting the importance of network building, as well as consistent funding to support those efforts. So in that, I'm actually going to show a few pictures because there were some communities that I just wanted to quickly reference. I received permission from one of the community leaders to just talk a minute or so about this community. Absolutely amazing. It reminds me in many ways of some of the presentations I've heard from the Ile Jean Charles Island. This is Grand Bayou. It's in Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana, not far from where Hurricane Katrina made landfall in Louisiana. She made landfall twice in Louisiana and Mississippi. And this is a Native American fishing village that is essentially an island. You have to go to the landing and then take a boat out to the island. Absolutely amazing place, beautiful culture, beautiful people that was destroyed by Hurricanes Katrina. And like another presentation I heard this morning, it is in an area that is outside of the levee protection system. So again, it's interesting as we're thinking about managed retreat and climate justice, it's whose communities are protected, I think is a really important point for us to think about. So let's fast forward to now. At Public Agenda, we've been working on community-driven resiliency planning through a project called Cycles of Resilience. Now it's based in Jamaica Bay, New York. If you all are not familiar, that's a large swath of Queens and Brooklyn in New York. Two of the communities or two of the areas that we're working with are predominantly Black immigrants from the West Indies and typically middle-class communities. So what we heard from folks as we did some listening sessions is that they were included in the initial consultation process after the storms, but they didn't feel like there was any feedback loop. They didn't feel like their voices were in earnest heard and what they said was incorporated in future policy. So it was really important for us to, what they expressed, it was important to have a few more resources that would prepare them to be more resilient and be able to elevate their voice in a more intentional way. So with the Cycles of Resilience project, we really utilize engagement techniques around the world that work, and we customize them for the communities that we're working with in Jamaica Bay in a sustained manner. So in a way that is in a cycle, so that they're always, there's sort of a regular flow and cadence to activities so that they know how to plug in and which activities would work best for them. So a couple of things about Jamaica Bay that's really interesting is in one of the communities that we worked with in Canarsie, folks had lived on the bay for years and actually did not know that they lived in Jamaica Bay and really found out when 6 feet of water was in their basement. A few people actually told us that. So it was really important to reintroduce them or introduce them to the water. It's an area where people of African descent have a fraught relationship with the water. As I said, many people emigrated there. Many of them emigrated in the 60s where they were actually segregated and not allowed access to the water. So there's some issues that we had to kind of think through as we designed Cycles of Resilience. First thing was an amazing opportunity where we actually brought people to the water. We were able to get access to a vessel from the City University of New York and brought people on the water. And for many lifelong residents of Jamaica Bay, that was the first time that they've been on the water. And I think it's really empowering to see your community from a different vantage point. And everybody reported that they loved that sort of introduction to their community or reintroduction to their community. We also employed an incredible engagement strategy of serious games. So we actually designed a game especially for Jamaica Bay and especially for this one community called Canarsie. And it was a fun way, it was Jamaica Bay Jeopardy, and it's a fun way of getting the community involved. We played the game at basketball tournaments, police precinct meetings, public housing tenant association meetings. It was a game that kids could play, you could bring your children, adults could play and have fun as well. And something really important about this game is it honors everybody who is involved. So you need to, if you, for example, there were some questions around some sort of technical scientific terms, and if you have somebody with scientific background, perfect for them. It involves some very technical questions about the city governance structure. Great for folks that know about that. And then it honors the knowledge of folks from the community. So really, it was a way to show that everybody's expertise is important. And the way that we can work together is have all people really at the table working together. Here we're playing it at a tenants association meeting, and these kids loved it and actually almost won. It was really cool. And the next thing that we did is a set of actions. We work with the community leaders that, or anybody who wanted to really be a part of these action teams to determine what are some of the challenges in the community that they want to address, come up with solutions, and then work together. We supported them on working together to address those solutions. So some of those action teams are still working. There's one that is creating a community-driven emergency plan. There is not one in Canarsie, so it's a really innovative, important step for them to take in building the resiliency. And another one is actually using citizen science to identify street level flooding. So there's ways that you can take different engagement activities to really move them towards action. We're doing a similar work in Southeast Queens. In that case, we're incorporating intergenerational conversations. That was something that was really important for the community members. And what we're looking for next year, what we're hoping to do is another turn of the cycle using games and activities and conversations and action groups, really to move towards a community-driven participatory budgeting process. If you're not familiar, participatory budgeting is one of the fastest growing forms of engagement around the world. It's really having average person decide where typically public monies are spent, but what our goal is to fundraise for this project so that there'll actually be monies associated with the projects that folks can vote on to fund. So for us, it's really important and interesting way of combining sustainability, resilience, equity, community engagement with economic democracy. I think those are the main points that I wanted to kind of showcase today.
I think if we were in as we open up the world and we were in person, Nicole, everybody would be giving hearty applause. So thanks, that was really fantastic. And as you can see, we're starting to build on this theme of, engaging people in many meaningful ways, and knowing that it's about assessment, but it's also about adaptation and acting in ways that help people. And I think we're going to hear a lot of similar themes and great work from Danny, who's up next. So Danny, if you wouldn't mind, you can turn your camera on and unmute and go ahead and share your slides if you have them.
Cool. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you again for having us. Let me pull up a little presentation I have here. I'm going to mainly show you guys just some photographs, some of the work that we do here at the Point, in relation again to some of the work that Nicole was even speaking about. To put us in context, the Point Community Development Corporation was founded in 1994 in the Hunts Point section of the South Bronx. Our mission, since then until now, has been, like I said, to really focus on the revitalization of our community, both economically and culturally. We view the community as an asset, the people in the community as assets. We see our neighbors as the front line for defense against climate change, and really work toward that. Like I said, we're an asset-based organization that really works off of environmental justice principles. For us, it's very important that as we continue to move forward, that we align ourselves properly with a just transition and anybody trying to do work in that direction. One of the things that I wanted to just, to point out as I do the slideshow is that, data, especially research and how our community is viewed, really doesn't, it drives the work that we do, but it really doesn't define the work that we do. And I think that's very important. When you think about a place like Hunts Point, a lot of folks might think about, waste transfer stations. They might think about, former spaces of incarceration for young people. You can name it, a myriad of issues. But when we think about Hunts Point, we think about also about solutions. We think about certain parameters that we kind of exist in, we have to work with, like the food distribution center being one of them, these industrial spaces, as well as a residential core, and kind of how do we all work together, or how do we create a plan, devise ideas for us to kind of be prepared for climate change, as again, we're like a waterfront peninsula, as you can see, right? We're surrounded again by toxic industry. We also have a huge food distribution center, so, again, the things that people think about our community are actually, huge assets to other communities, when people don't want to dispose of their own waste, Hunts Point takes it, unfortunately, where all the food comes, maybe half the food you ate today was maybe processed or distributed, through the Hunts Point market. So again, we kind of face the brunt of a lot of issues, again, that are compounded on our community, but again, doesn't really define the work that we fully do, and this is more of the community spaces that we know, it's young people, we serve several hundred young people every year in a variety of back to school programs, academic, both and cultural and art-based, as well as stewardship-based, our young people are also, again, on the front line of this conversation. They help lead a lot of the campaigns that we do on the front lines, but they also, again,
Hey,
are very talented. Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. If
Sure.
you, we don't see slides, so I don't know if you're planning on
Oh,
sharing.
I've been showing slides the whole time, but I don't know. Oh, geez. Okay.
If you just hit share screen on the bottom of the Zoom.
This is
There
what
we go.
I've been doing. There you go. I've been talking about this the whole time. I'm sorry, I didn't see the screen because I was I was like on presenter mode. I thought you guys see me better, right? All right. So I'm gonna cut the other ones in the beginning here because we already talked about them. Again, as you can see, right, this is the neighborhood. This is what it looks like from above. All right, these are young people, like I was talking. And again, really looking at solutions, in our community, right? Like I said, we're not defined by data, but it really makes us think about what we're going to do, how we're going to build. And things like waterfront parks are basic amenities that you think that most communities would have access to. Our community has fought to actually get access to and actually, have created. So park spaces like Broad Point Park, Hunts Point Riverside Park, again, were not amenities that were bought by anybody. They were really something that was demanded by the work of the young people in the communities that we serve. And it brings us to, again, ideas like these, right? Like, we sit down, we work in partnership with a lot of different groups, several offices of the mayor, the EDC, researchers, universities, local residents, small businesses, right? To create this plan, to think again holistically how we want to view our community, what kind of plans do we want to create for our community, especially again in the era of climate change and Anthropocene, where we have to kind of really not only be prepared and be resilient, but also think about the opportunities that we can really take advantage of at this point, that we can create for ourselves to not only, again, make a change, but to make a change that's very unique and very specific to our community. And the things that we think about, again, besides securing the waterfront, are things like owning our own infrastructure. So the very infrastructure, the pollution that kills us off, the PM 2.5, we could combat that. We can create an alternative. And what you're looking at here are plans for large-scale community shared solar, as well as, again, coastal protection opportunities, again, that the community is actually a part of building, speaking about, and also hopefully maintaining along the way. This is, again, a big part of our work is in telling the story. We like to engage with the community. As Nicole was saying, you do meetings with communities, but also creating opportunities, to go from just engaging the community and presenting them with data. You go also into the ideas of planning, and then you go into the ideas of stewardship. And for our community, that looks like a lot of things. That looks like some people, again, picking up a shovel and helping us farm, but it also looks at times like, people taking up a camera and using it to document and tell the story, the narrative of our community in a way that, again, changes the narrative a little bit, but also really builds off of the good work that we're doing here. Again, we work with artists of all types. We incubate small businesses with artists. We engage young people in the arts all the way to seniors throughout the week in a variety of activities. Mr. Rodney, I'm glad he showed up on the screen right here because he's a really good example of, again, how we work and how we bring people into the work through stewardship opportunities. And besides the as a result of the South Bronx Community Resiliency Agenda, which I'll share on the chat, a link to, one of our big planning processes, again, was not only ownership of large-scale infrastructure and really thinking about coastal resiliency and energy, but also, again, how do we create a group of people, again, the front line, if you will, of folks that are going to be prepared for the effects of climate change and storm surges and heat waves and things of that nature. So Mr. Ronnie is one of these folks that works in our Be a Buddy program, which has been very successful working with the Department of Health, the Fund for Public Health in New York, again, to create if you will, a core of residents, again, that are prepared to respond to climate emergencies before, during, and after something is happening with their most immediate neighbors. Things like Fish Parade, again, when we gather information, waterfront activities. I wish you can see this picture here with folks, again, playing in the community, again, opportunities to outreach. Another one of our big projects this right now is this Bronx-wide platform. Again, not only do we want to see changes in our community, but how does it look across the board? And we work with something like 20-something organizations. I think it's 26 organizations signed on for the original, if you will, declaration for this platform. Again, that looks at the Bronx from every corner. And again, how do we leverage opportunities to organize together to see these changes and work on them? Again, a lot of the visual arts and beautification of the community, backpack giveaways, cooling stations. That's another area that we're also working closely to develop this particular summer, where we'll be able to offer spaces for seniors and folks on the street level to be able to cool off, again, to mitigate some of the effects of the heat island effect that we see in our community. These are some examples here of us going to Puerto Rico and helping to bring some Wi-Fi, as well as meeting with elected officials like AOC, again, to really talk about the work that we're doing here and really kind of, again, set the agenda, help set the agenda for a green future. Again, speaking about, again, opportunities to engage people, cooling stations, expos, again, bringing people together, citizen science projects. We're working on some of those around data collection, heat, air quality, indoor and outdoors, big on our list. And again, always finding a way to not only fight and move the needle forward and campaign, but also again celebrate the talents of our community members and the people that we work with. It's very important, that we have some sort of joyful resistance along the way, especially at a time like now when we are, again, trying to come back from the effects of COVID in a way that, that centers the community again, but also really, again, taps into them as part of the solution. And this is, again, Thanksgiving giveaway, just us kind of working. This is kind of our work here. I'm going to jump off now, but thank you for that. Sorry for the delay.
Thank you so much, Danny. That was fantastic. I love that data doesn't define us. As much as we're here to talk about, how data, how we arrive at what information and assessment can help, it doesn't define communities, and that's really fantastic. Okay, so we're going to switch gears and go to Allison.
All right, thanks, Adam. Thanks, Danny and Nicole, for those great presentations. I thought that was really great slides. Now I have to have my boring slides up to follow you, but that's okay. Let's see if I can get this in presenter mode. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. And I apologize, I don't have great Wi-Fi today. I'm in transit. So if I start breaking up, somebody can just let me know and I can end early. I think what we did with the Climate Knowledge Exchange really underscores the work that Danny and Nicole are doing, because we set out to talk to people. We talked to a lot of different people across different sectors and stations and stakeholder groups. Sorry, excuse me 1 minute. I am so sorry. I just realized my computer wasn't plugged in and I didn't want to die in the middle of my presentation. So I think that first, I just want to let you know, we did talk to people across the board. We talked to people in agencies. We talked to people in regional and local nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, infrastructure providers, universities, students. And as Adam mentioned in the beginning, there was strong convergence around the need to better engage communities and to listen to the communities. Everybody expressed a desire to find better ways to make this happen and to incorporate that feedback into the work that both the city is doing, our infrastructure providers, and how we can work together moving forward. So I'm just going to give you an overview of what we found in the Climate Knowledge Exchange. The intent was to kind of listen to people and do a stock taking of what the research priorities were, hearing from the people who are going to be impacted by climate change in New York City, and then to kind of see what those focus areas should be and to produce the report. This is the report, State of Climate Knowledge 2021. And the key focus areas that we identified in all of these workshops and conversations were that people have a strong desire to hear about how climate change is going to impact their daily lives and their quality of life. We need new management capacity for how to manage all of the different components of climate change and the need for collaboration across all these different stakeholders and across departments within the city agencies. Also that there was a strong emphasis, especially in New York City, given the history of Sandy there, the strong emphasis on climate in the built environment. Anna is going to talk a little bit more on the connection to managed retreat and different adaptation pathways, so I'm not going to talk too much on that. And then also just to underscore Danny and Nicole's work, a focus on community engagement and education around the issues of climate change. So I'll just talk a little bit more deeply about each focus area, and then I'll hand it over to Anna. The first focus area we heard over and over was that people were not only interested in knowing what the risks were and what the hazards were, but how it impacted them, what the vulnerability was. Like, what do I need to do? What's going to impact me where I live? And we heard across the board that people wanted to know how it was going to impact not just, that they were going to get hot or that water might come, but how that's going to affect their housing, how that'll impact their health, education, all of these different sectors. Also, environmental justice was a consistent theme across all of our workshops, and no matter who we talk to, this is a really important topic to everyone, which is great to hear. Also, health, of course, was a major focus given the pandemic and this outsized outsized focus on health issues. Connecting climate and health was a big topic that frequently came up. And then, of course, the impact on the local economy and perceptions of climate risk and how those vary across different stakeholders. Focus area 2, the things especially talking to city agencies, people were really trying to think of new ways to assess adaptation strategies, to weigh the pros and cons, cost-benefit analysis, thinking of how to compare shoreline hardening with nature-based solutions and how to engage on those different topics, how to assess non-monetary values such as equity and other social priorities, how to incorporate health and socioeconomic impacts into the process of analysis, and also just how to include community knowledge. We know that it's important. Everybody wants to have better ways of communicating and engaging the public, but how do we include that information in the decision-making process within the different departments and agencies? Also, just kind of how to weigh like, as I said, the different adaptation strategies, when to employ them, what the timeframes are, and when you need to switch gears. So that was another important part of the climate knowledge exchange, is that it is a sustained assessment process to identify research gaps and knowledge gaps around climate change. And that's going to happen year over year, so that as things change, things that we don't know start to occur, we can capture all of that data and switch gears when we need to. Focus area 3 was around climate in the built environment. So this is a picture from, I think this one was developed by Stantec for the New York City Economic Development Corporation. And this is part of the plan for the Battery Coastal Resilience Project in the Battery Park area. So things like this, how do we design these projects and who's involved in how we make these decisions? I think it was Nicole who said, language matters. Who's the expert? How do we design these? Whose input do we use? What metrics do we use? Who chooses the metrics? There's politics to how we make these designs. This one in particular is a mix of different hardening strategies, walls and berms, as well as some nature-based solutions. So typically these kind of waterfront redevelopments will be able to be flooded. The buildings will be set back from the shoreline. So these kind of redeveloping the shoreline of New York will be really important going forward, and how we have conversations about these shoreline redevelopments where people live, where people are increasingly living, is a really important part of the process of the assessment practice and the initiative of the Climate Knowledge Exchange. Just having opening spaces for conversations on how we make these designs and how we redevelop these areas, and what strategies we're using to address multiple climate hazards, because parks, of course, can also have a mitigation impact, right? They can lower the greenhouse gas emissions of the city. They can also provide other benefits like lowering, giving people a space to go when it's hot, high heat stress in the city. And so it's not just about the flooding and the coastal resiliency, but there are lots of other benefits and ecosystem services available in open space. So how we think about those co-benefits when we're designing these spaces was another topic that frequently came up across all of our workshops. Focus area 4 was climate communication, education, and engagement. So we heard a lot about how is the best way to communicate around the topic of climate change. People want different types of formats, not just reports. People want different multimedia formats, not just maps and engaging interactive formats like that, but also non-internet based, because there are a lot of people who don't have internet access. So having some videos and some pamphlets or whatever it is to distribute, especially community leaders wanted some information that they could share with their communities. And also how to incorporate climate and climate justice into multiple education levels. We heard some people focusing on K through 12 education and having resources available for children to learn about the issues that the city's facing. Also just how to integrate different types of knowledge around climate change under one roof and have some information flows across different disciplines, including psychology, behavioral economics, and other social science knowledge. I also liked what Nicole says, about who is the expert. And I think that that's part of the issue here. How do we learn to hear each other? How do we make sure knowledge is being exchanged across all the different stakeholders who need to be part of the conversation? And also, as Danny said, the data, doesn't drive the work that a lot of these communities do. And also, the climate knowledge exchange doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. A lot of communities, like Danny's and the ones Nicole's working with are already doing amazing work. There's, we can build off of all of this momentum that's already been built and engage partners and how we can have these conversations going forward and how we can identify which adaptation pathways are going to work best for which communities. And so the climate knowledge exchange process will be an annual process, an assessment, engagement initiative that the process itself is building a network of people to have these conversations and to share information. And then also just documenting what the research needs are. And if it's not a research needs, what the other needs are, and just making sure that information is available and accessible. Because I know from my perspective, I'm a researcher, there's a lot of times I want to engage communities and I don't have that network available to me to find the communities who might need or might want to partner with me in the co-production of some kind of knowledge. And so just having that network available will be a huge asset to both the research community and to communities so that we have well-focused, well-targeted research that really serves the needs of the city going forward. So hopefully that's a space that the Climate Knowledge Exchange will be able to fill going forward, but there's a lot of work to be done on how to do that well and how to make sure that people don't feel exhausted by the process, but that they really benefit from it. And also that research funding is well targeted, that we're not spending a lot of money on areas of research that aren't serving the community. So I'm gonna just stop there and turn it over to Anna to talk a little bit more in the state level context and really connect us more to the topic of the conference managed retreat. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Allison. Go ahead, Anna.
Thanks, Adam. I will share my screen now. All right. Thanks everyone for listening in, and very honored to be speaking after such great panelists. I will be presenting on sustained assessments across New York City and New York State and sharing some of the perspectives on managed retreat, what we specifically heard from community members and agencies on the topic of coastal adaptation and relocation throughout the engagement process. As I mentioned, I'm a part of the Consortium on Climate Risk in the Urban Northeast, which is the small little yellow strip on the Northeast coast on this map. And the consortium is a part of the NOAA RESA program. There are 11 research teams across the US that help expand capacity for climate change adaptation, focusing on the regional scale. And as the team's sustained assessment specialist, I've worked on 2 related engagement processes, one at the city level, which Allison and Adam have covered, and another at the state level. So I'll be focusing on the interconnection between those 2 processes. So first, I worked on this report, the Climate Needs Assessment for New York State with NYSERDA. And we interviewed and surveyed community-based organizations and municipal agencies across the state on what should be included in the update of the state's climate adaptation plan, which is called ClimateAid, and that's this report on the left. While I was working on this needs assessment, I connected with Adam and Allison, who were working on the climate knowledge exchange, and we began to coordinate between the state and the city level engagement processes, and were able to make sure that the documents really spoke to each other, in some cases using the same approaches or using the same questions so that we could compare and contrast information from the local to the state level. So the climate needs assessment contributes to this ClimateAid report at the state level, and the climate knowledge exchange, as Adam mentioned, is really partnered closely with the New York City panel on climate change. So both of these reports are able to influence policy as well as influence the scientific research agenda. And this quote at the bottom of my slide came from one of the climate knowledge exchange workshops and really captures the purpose of this work, which is that we have to really hear what people are saying before we start planning. And instead of risk assessments, I'd call it needs assessments. And that's the type of work that these two reports in the middle are trying to capture. So for the remainder of the presentation, I'd like to kind of dig into a little bit of what we heard from both of those processes. What did people say about managed retreat and climate adaptation? And I think that the type of engagement process that we used is really helpful in kind of getting into a little bit of depth around these issues. So often we expect that managed retreat will be thought of as a yes or a no option. Either retreat is inevitable or retreat is equivalent to defeat. It's a failure to adapt rather than an adaptation option, or it's just impossible to implement. And this framing of the issue has made conversations around managed retreat even more challenging. But the engagement process at the city and state level showed that communities and agency groups are thinking about managed retreat and relocation in a much more nuanced way than this. And I think that this type of engagement is a great way to elucidate that. So here are a handful of what I'm calling managed retreat spectrums that emerged throughout the engagement process. And each one covers an aspect or a feature of managed retreat that really has options on a sliding scale. It's not binary, it's not yes or no. And I'll explain each of these spectrums on the following slides. And I'll be using quotes directly from the city and state engagement processes to really get into how New Yorkers are thinking about this issue, at least the New Yorkers that we engaged with this first time around. As Adam mentioned, we have ambitions to really expand the scope to capture more feedback. And I also want to mention that managed retreat is not a topic that we explicitly asked about in either of these processes. So as Allison covered, some of the major themes were those four topics that she covered. Managed retreat was not as covered, but I think when it was mentioned, it was really illuminating. And so I'm going to cover some of the things that people mentioned. So the first spectrum is about kind of the length of time of retreat, from not relocating at all, which could be a protection in place strategy or an accommodation strategy, to the idea of temporary relocation, which could be evacuation after a storm or during the process of a retrofitting of a home, to the idea of permanent relocation. And one participant from the community workshop said, we're letting people continue to settle on the front lines. When will we stop? There's a sense from some community members that increased development on the coast isn't necessarily a sustainable long-term solution. And people also expressed that one area of progress in the city was the effort to elevate homes after Sandy. When people are evacuated or temporarily relocated because of damage to their homes, I think it's interesting to recognize that even protection in place strategies are not eliminating displacement. They're really shortening the displacement process. And when it comes to permanent relocation, multiple people said that the biggest barrier to addressing climate change is the need for a frank discussion about coastal retreat. So while people may have very different views on whether to stay or move individually, or whether a community is interested in pursuing that option, there does seem to be interest in getting the conversation started on permanent relocation as a long-term sustainable adaptation strategy in the city. So the next spectrum is whether managed retreat occurs before, during, or after a disaster. And there's interest in more preparation research rather than only focusing on recovery after a disaster hits, although obviously disaster recovery is incredibly important. There's a general sentiment that resources, funding, and awareness of risk tend to increase after a disaster, which makes it difficult to be proactive and to prepare before a disaster hits. And at the same time, multiple agencies mentioned that there's a lack of understanding about how people and resources move around during and after a disaster. And so on this front, I think we need more information about the factors that influence individuals' perceptions of their own risk and their own personal interest in retreating, and whether events like Sandy impact people's opinions about retreat. Folks' comments also touched on relocation at different spatial scales, from the household to the community scale to regional and international migration. And at the household scale, multiple participants from the community workshops said that one of the ways that they use climate data is to identify where not to move or where not to buy a house. And while it's incredibly important that individuals have access to data and information to make their own decisions at the household scale, ad hoc household retreat isn't necessarily adequate when it comes to thinking about retreat at larger scales, at the community scale. And agencies recognized that at that level, you really need strategic retreat to ensure communities thrive with sufficient assistance to residents and businesses relocating, using acquired property for adaptation measures selected based on climate projections and community priorities. And so there needs to be a bit of a balance between individual decision-making, having the information available to be able to do that, and at higher scales, really scaling up the amount of resources and support that is offered in order to make relocation feasible and equitable. And at the higher level in New York State, there are conversations happening about regional and global scale in migration, whether people are going to be moving to New York State, to New York City, or to other parts of the state. And I think these conversations about in-migration and out-migration need to be better integrated. Then there is the spectrum of retreat policies which occur at the local, regional, or national scale. And multiple participants commented on the Build It Back program, an initiative which raised houses following Sandy, including in the Rockaways, but simultaneously acknowledged that the tides are rising and there's only so much we can do. So while local policy is critical to recovery and resiliency, there's a sense that it may not be enough on its own without coordination at higher scales of governance. And at the regional scale, we again hear that areas such as Western New York have been discussed as a climate oasis, and how the big issue for that region is preparing for an influx of climate refugees. But there's still confusion around this messaging and uncertainty, what relocation and what migration is going to look like at the regional scale. So there is currently a bit of a regional policy void when it comes to managed retreat issues in New York and the Northeast more generally, which makes it difficult for a region or even a state to really understand how to plan. And finally, at the national scale, it's really challenging because there's a lot of research showing the barriers that exist due to the structure of national policies like the flood insurance program affecting what FEMA can fund when it comes to coastal adaptation. So there's interest in locally relevant policy that's supported by accessible resources from higher scales of government, including the national government. And the final spectrum that I'll cover is the range from a standalone managed retreat strategy to those that have co-benefits, all the way to those that are really fully integrated multi-objective strategies, of which managed retreat is just a single part. And one barrier identified in New York City is that the focus has continued to be on physical resiliency and often is not focused on people. And there's a sense that the agencies are not necessarily talking to each other, that there are silos that are preventing these kind of standalone strategies from scaling up in a way that provides co-benefits. And when we think about co-benefits, we have to make sure that we're avoiding trade-offs. And so when we think about affordable housing as it relates to coastal adaptation or managed retreat, making sure that a standalone strategy is not necessarily going to negatively impact the ability of the city to achieve affordable housing goals. When asked about visions of the future, multiple individuals shared kind of similar style scenarios, one which you can see here, where multi-generational education on adaptation is built into the very fabric of our neighborhoods, and where retreat from rising seas hasn't left a wasteland, but rather a regenerative parkland that all community members can enjoy. I think this is a very beautiful vision of the future, and these visions also include strong focus on equity, in which communities have the resources and information to stay in place safely or to relocate with dignity following community-driven planning processes. Ultimately, communities expressed much more creativity than current kind of standalone retreat strategies would be able to deliver in the long term. So what are the main takeaways from these two processes at the state level and at the city level? The first for me is that sustained engagement provides nuance and it builds networks. Nuance really allows us to better understand where individuals and communities land on adaptation spectrums, and moving away from thinking about managed retreat or any type of coastal adaptation as either inevitable or impossible. And networks, as Nicole and Danny both expressed, they're built through engagement, deeper engagement, sustained engagement, and connecting community members to each other, as well as to academics and policymakers, increases the resiliency by really contributing to that social cohesion that we know is incredibly important to not only responding to disasters, but also to preparing for disasters and to cohesive adaptation planning in general. The second takeaway is that there is interest in having conversations around retreat. That's not universal, certainly does not apply to every community or to every individual, but when people envision retreat, they envision strategies which address legacies of injustice, which contribute to ecological conservation, strategies which make cities greener and more livable, and prioritize people over financial assets. And I think that academics and policymakers would benefit greatly from really centering this type of community creativity about the future and thinking about how managed retreat and coastal adaptation could contribute or at least play a role in just transitions of the future. And I think that this type of sustained engagement process is at least a step in the right direction towards facilitating some of those conversations. So I will leave it there. Thanks.
Fantastic job, Anna. I love the idea of centering creativity, not just because that's what we heard, or we heard that from people, but also we've seen that, in both Danny's presentation and in Nicole's presentation in the Bronx and in South Brooklyn and Southeast Queens. We saw such creativity in the work that communities are doing. And like Allison said, we really want to build on that. Okay, so we are going to take some questions, but first we have I wanted to talk about some topics that connect this thread. So we'll do a combination of both. And if I could ask all the speakers to turn their camera back on, I have a couple of questions I wanted to pose to folks and just hear from them about. And the first one is, how do we help people advocate for themselves? And why don't we start with Nicole, and then we'll move around and other panelists, if you don't mind, just use the raise hand. But Nicole, do you mind kicking us off with some thoughts?
Right.
On
so
that?
the question is, how do we help communities advocate for themselves? That was the question.
Yep.
It's interesting. That's an interesting question. I think at the core, I think that's a question for the community. I'm not sure if I could answer that question. But what I would say is it's essential that people have access to information, factual information. It's essential that people are at least informed about plans, processes ahead of time, that they are not engaged once a decision has already been made. and that at the end of the day, for me, it's really about them. Sorry, I'm still processing that question, but it's a little bit difficult to say how we can help them. At the end of the day, that's their choice. So it's really, I think, a lot of our work is around engaging them, around making sure they have the information, making sure that they have the tools to advocate if they want to. It's really up to them on how they want to, what direction they want to take that. Pardon me if it's not very clear, but I'm still sort of processing that question.
No, I think that's great. Starting with what help, if especially in some cases, helping them define what the ways they want help. And as we've seen, it takes work to do that. Information plays a role, but so does like a process, a really valuable social process. Others?
I think that I agree with Nicole. It's a difficult question to frame, but I think that working in an academic institution, one thing I've recognized so much is that academic information tends to be valued so much more highly than other types of information. And so in the sphere that I work, one way that I think about advocacy is really, in general, democratizing science a bit more so that the types of information that we're including in our science are more diverse. So that when academic literature is listened to, it is more diverse, but then also making sure that research is really driven by community priorities and not necessarily by solely personal research interests, which don't necessarily have any connection to community priorities when it comes to climate adaptation.
I would just to add to that, I think for us, the way we see the work is really generational and intergenerational and multi-generational. For us, the part of the strategy is creating a space that's sustained long enough that, whenever you are ready to be activated, that there's a space there for you, and you can enter in a variety of ways. And for young people, that might mean, like I said earlier, that they want to maybe try out circus, so they want to come in and learn about dance or something to that effect. And then they start to learn about, community organizing or stewardship, and they connect it back to logging. I think strategy, but I think again, kind of meeting people where they are, and again, kind of being prepared to offer them a role somehow within the paradigm of the work that you're doing is very key. That stewardship, I think that's so key, because I think again, when people can kind of embody the people that they need to be, they start to become those people. And again, it may not work 1 week to the next, but it may take again a number of years and a long-term campaign to kind of sustain it. But again, meeting people halfway and kind of giving people that space to kind of do it however they feel they want to do it is important. And again, that looks like a lot of different things for different people.
Building on that, I wanted to ask what resources are required to help build networks within and across places and people. So what do we need to do this work and continue this work, sustain this work? Allison, why don't we start with, go ahead, Danny, please.
I didn't know if you were asking me, because I finished the last question. Yeah, it's just so many things. I was just thinking, one of the ways that I know we've been most effective most recently, especially, let me say through COVID, has been just like really having strong relationships and alliances. And I think somebody mentioned it, like Nicole, I think mentioned, like we have to be professionally prepared to listen in a variety of tables, regardless if we want to hear the message or not. And I think that that's very key right now, is that we kind of are able to work with people, again, across the aisle, on our side, however you look at it, to kind of push into a new direction. And that's the hard work, I think. But that's really the main resources, that we have each other, that we have people that we can connect to around food security, or that we can connect to with people around, climate, or water fresh water, whatever. Like, I mean, so many different campaigns, but it has to work with other people, and we can't continue to kind of do it in silos. We can serve as a model in our community for what's possible, but we can't surely say and be prescriptive for everybody else's neighborhood. But if we work together and know each other's work along the way, it's going to be more valuable,
Yeah, I was just going to add the same thing. I think the social capital and the resources around who has the energy and the time to create these networks and to commit to following this throughout all of the years that we need to continue to be devoted for this, which is decades. And so a lot of times, people who are championing these projects, either within city governments or within local communities or NGOs, they change jobs, they move on, they do other things, and that can really impact the strength of the movement. And so I think in terms of resources, we all know we need political will and financial resources, and those two themes came up over and over and over in the climate research exchange, but climate knowledge exchange, sorry. But I think also it's just the people who are committed to making the conversation stay alive, and also creating those connections between people so that people have someone to ask when they are in need, or when they don't have information they feel like they should have, so that they know where to go for that information. And so just those information resources and communication channels, in addition to, of course, the financial resources and political backing.
One resource I'll add is time. Participatory processes take time. And I think that it is typical that the excuse of climate change being so urgent is used to justify not pursuing participatory processes, or not really taking the time to make a process equitable. And so I think that in the end, we can't create more time, but we have to use the time that we have for participatory processes up front. Otherwise, the solutions created are not successful. So I think that we need to rethink about our time.
Should we move, Adam, do you want to move to the audience Q&A or ask another discussion question?
We can move to the audience Q&A. I was going to actually, I don't know if Nicole has anything to add to that last question while she thinks about it. I wanted to delve down a layer deeper on what all three of you were saying, which is, yes, financial resources are required. Specifically, I think, if we take the climate knowledge exchange as an example, we need, if we're going to ask people to co-own this process with us and help, build these networks, we're asking them for time. That means staff time. That means literally people in places actually doing the work in their community. So I need to know that, like, that I can turn to Danny, but I'm making an ask of Danny. I'm making an ask of Nicole. So all the organizations in that network and the people in that network need to be supported. And that can sometimes happen in the context of a research grant, or a grant, but a lot of times it can't. A lot of times that work needs to be supported. And even in the context, like, even if we had, city funding to a lot to this project, which we don't, we're happy to put the in-kind time in, we can't procure things that are really valuable for engagement processes, like childcare and food, and we can do translation services. Again, we're happy to do that kind of in-kind support, but there are just things that we can't necessarily procure or fund. And that all needs to happen in addition to supporting the researchers, because these engagement processes have to exist in their own right. And then we can help researchers participate, not have the engagement happen in the context of a specific study. So anyway, that's my 2 cents. Nicole, I don't know if you wanted to address that question before we go on to the Q&A.
Yeah, I mean, it's essential. It's essential in doing good engagement. It's essential in doing inclusive and equitable engagement. The way you're saying, the childcare, food, especially in this day and age of everything being remote, really being really understanding that not everybody has access to Wi-Fi, not everybody has access to, to a computer. So really thinking through how do we really make engagement, make climate justice inclusive and equitable, and are we willing to do that? And sometimes that's financial resources as well. And I think, really thinking through, I think we talked about this internally, the question around providing stipend, making sure that people are compensated if they want to be. There's times that I've offered stipends and people said no, and other times they say thank you for honoring my knowledge and my contribution. And I think even taking it a step further, which we did in Cycles of Resilience, is actually hiring people from the community to join staff if they wish, and we did that in Canarsie. And it's really about walking the walk and talking the talk and making sure that we represent the community. And I think those are all aspects of doing good engagement. Yeah.
All right, Allison, I think we should use the remaining time to field some questions that came in during the presentations.
Sure. I just kind of going in order. I know we can all see the questions. Danny, do you want to start by answering this question somebody has for you about community-led solutions that work? And I think there's a related question around, you've engaged the community around the arts, and another person is interested in community solar. So maybe you could address those two questions at the same time.
Yeah, sure. So for us, again, I think, a lot of the work that we do is creative based, so we meet a lot of artists that come to our space because they want to be a part of, let's say, a community of dancers or let's say theater, writers or whatever, like whatever the source is for the week, right? Culinary artists, whatever that is. Most of these folks, again, have, because they're coming to these activities, they tend to have a little more time, and again, sometimes you can really kind of spend time with them and look at what they're doing and work with them on whatever talent they have and sort of start to infuse that with some of the work that we do. And, I mean, I'm going to mention, for example, myself, or even, I came to the point in 2002, really to learn black and white photography in the darkroom. That was really my only intention. I mean, I was doing this work similarly outside. I was doing educational work and doing leadership development with young people, but I wasn't necessarily thinking of myself as an organizer or somebody that was working with organizers. And so, that kind of twist of like, when you look at the community, take a closer look with a camera, came with some hard questions that I had to ask myself. Like, now that I know this stuff, what am I going to do about it? And that's kind of what the art part is about sometimes, right? It kind of leads you to certain truths and certain ideas, and then what are you going to do about it? And for me, it was, well, let me continue to do my artwork, but then let me also continue to think about this environmental justice idea and what are these principles that people are talking about, and like, what's Hamed, and like, how do I integrate that into the work that I'm doing when I'm out there working with the community. So that's one part of it, but that also leads right into that ownership piece, right? Like, I can own my photographs, why can't I own my power? Why can't Hunts Point own its power? And if you own it, then you decide what happens to it. And like I say, maybe it's like a cheap correlation, but photograph and having energy and having ownership, like I choose what happens to my images, whether or not they get published, whether or not my friends see them, we should have that same decision-making power in how we plug into, let's say, solar, or how we plug into the internet, or again, when we're able to think about planning for what happens if there's a huge flood in our community. It's that same ownership, but it takes practice in a lot of ways. And I think being disenfranchised, being marginalized for many years, having to work 2-3 jobs, maybe not having the proper diet might not help some folks have the time and the ability to kind of even think in that direction. And that's part of the work too, is like, you have to kind of think holistically, because people are not necessarily coming to the point to be activated in this way, even though they end up that way sometimes, I'm not sure if I answered the question, but I tried to, yeah.
No, that was great. I think that's a really important point. And I think that also leads into one of these questions we have for Nicole on how to scale up a lot of this community-led resiliency planning, because as you're saying, people come to this from different places and different interests in being involved in the community. And so how do we how do we leverage that up? Nicole, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can take a stab at that just based on the work that I've done. I think network building is the best way to scale it up. A lot of even just in recently connecting similar groups. So for example, there's a grassroots nonprofit in Canarsie, and we've been connecting them with an organization on the lower Ninth Ward, very similar, both led by Black men. They're, just finding sort of affinities groups and linking them together. I think that's the first start. And then from there, network building, where in that is incorporated some leadership development. And it doesn't have to be a workshop. For example, in the work that we did on the Gulf Coast, it was slowly identifying leaders that were more emerging leaders, didn't even have to be young leaders. Many of the people who were in the network were organizers for decades, maybe even civil rights organizers. And what I saw, there wasn't really a space for folks that didn't have that sort of history. So how do you uplift other people that could really be amazing leaders? So what we did is gave them opportunities to lead within the network. So you're through practice, enabling folks to lead. So then you're building a network of younger in the movement leaders that are able to take on networks or take on this work in their own communities or across the country. And I'm just going to say it, funding. There's no way to scale up work without consistent, appropriate funding. So it's really looking at, quite frankly, decolonizing philanthropy, making sure that the funding streams are sustainable, making sure that the application processes are not onerous and are appropriate for younger, emerging, less established nonprofits that are perfectly situated to do the work and not funding the same groups all the time. So I think, it's a real sort of liberation philosophy regarding what does this work look like?
That was great. All great suggestions. I think now we can kind of connect this to Adam. If you want to reflect on some of these questions about the role of the city in all of this decision making around retreat. We have some questions. Somebody who was on an advisory board during the public sessions around the waterfront management plan, and how retreat is part of the conversation and how it's not. Do you want to take some of those, Adam?
I'm sure I can do my best. I'm not, we have parts of our office that are working with the New York City Department of Planning on the waterfront plan. The draft is up right now. I believe the deadline got extended past the conference, and so people can look at it. But I think, as far as the language around and the content around climate resiliency, there are sections that talk about sort of whether really supporting communities and supporting and changing the way we do planning to achieve some of the things that we've talked about in terms of not the city imposing its will on people, but building political will from the ground up. And it is intentional. I think intentionally not using the word retreat, but that doesn't mean it shies away from talking about the fact that there are some places that will be permanently inundated, and the reason for that is that I think retreat sort of feels like that sort of it achieves that the opposite of the intended effect. Where that's something that we would impose, like a decision that's already been made, instead of something that we have to talk about and decide with people and figure out how we adapt, whether it across those various spectrums that Anna laid out that I thought were really nice, that sort of make it not a binary decision, not a yes or no, or but instead a whole complex web of decisions, some of which tie to existing institutions that need to be reformed, like the National Flood Insurance Program. I know one other person spoke to that. So I think what we were really trying to do as a city there is draw out some of the nuance that Anna laid out really well, and really try to work towards a different paradigm for waterfront planning.
Great, thank you. We're running a little short on time, but Anna, I'd love for you to hear you reflect on this question on housing. Housing is obviously intimately linked with the question of retreat, and the buyout program, of course, was a state level program, and we didn't ask specifically about housing during the course of the climate knowledge exchange, but of course it comes up. Almost any sustainability string you pull leads back to housing. So Anna, how did you guys address housing in the state level assessments, and what do you think about how it came up in the climate knowledge exchange?
Yeah, so in the first iteration of ClimateAid, which is the state level climate adaptation plan from NYSERDA, there wasn't a specific chapter dedicated to the built environment. And we heard a lot in this needs assessment process that folks wanted a dedicated chapter on this topic. And primarily it's related to these issues of coastal adaptation, to housing affordability. And I'm not particularly an expert on the housing side. I think that one of the biggest barriers that was mentioned is the fact that when cost benefit analysis is used to decide which neighborhoods or which areas of the coast will be protected, a lot of times housing that isn't basically qualified as economically viable then doesn't make the cut for which neighborhoods will be protected. And so there's a huge equity piece here in terms of which areas are protected, which places are sort of left to retreat or left to sort it out in some other capacity. So I think that I don't have a solution to this question. I think it's incredibly complicated, but in addition to housing affordability, I think that the tools that we use to assess coastal adaptation strategies in different neighborhoods need to be based on much wider criteria than just the economic value of a home.
Great, thanks for that. I think I just want to be mindful of time because I want to keep on schedule. Adam, do you want to wrap us up, or anybody else who wants to make any final comments?
Well, I'll make a couple, but I'm happy to hear from our other panelists. I mean, I think what we wanted to do is really showcase that, sort of make this a more nuanced space, really show how that even though we're coming from different spaces and we all sort of play different instruments, we can still make music together, and really elevate this idea that that we're building social capital does take time, building trust and building relationships and even just building a dialogue does take time. But we're also, I think, quite frankly, watching the work of communities and community organizers and people who do civic engagement, we're getting a little bit, there's a lot of good practice that we can follow, and it's not impossible. And that's really, I think, bodes well for how we work ahead for a better future on our coasts. So thank you to all the panelists, and thanks to everybody for tuning in.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Thank you. Have a good evening. Take care.